Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, before we begin, please, just a reminder that in the description section below you will find my link tree, and in that link tree is my Patreon account. I have a $1 tier donation, $1 a month that you don't mind parting with. It will help me afford things like, comics, and food, and power, and rent, things that are kind of necessary to sustain life. But then also comics, great, fun, wonderful comics that I want to read and talk about here on the channel to create conversations about comics that are substantial and interesting. Interesting in air quotes. But whatever the case, if you've got $1 a month that you don't mind parting with, please, please, please help me out. I'll be immensely appreciative. I'll call your name out on the show. I'll take you out to dinner. Okay, probably not that last one. But I will at least call your name out and say, hey, you're cool and I like you. So, please, 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 if you got $1 that you don't mind parting with, hit me up. Now, you will note the book to my right is the one that we talked about in the previous video, Dissolving Classroom by Junji Ito. And if that video wasn't enough to tell you, I'm a fanboy for Junji Ito, #no apologies. And about the same time that I was finishing this book, I was finishing up another book that, oddly enough, was kind of, similar, and in fact it had a very similar title as too. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about grade school. Now, growing up, I suspect most of us attended grade school of some form or fashion. Public or private, whatever the case, they probably had some manner of reading assignments for you to do. They would give you a short story, or they would give you a play, or they would give you a novel. Now, usually from between the grades of about first grade through sixth grade, the books in question are good. They're solid books, but they're not excessively challenging for the most part because you're trying to establish literacy and you're trying, in terms of school grades anyway, you're trying to just get kids to think about the stuff that they're reading. It was really only in middle school, for me anyway, that the books that we started reading began to become a little bit more challenging. We began reading the works of Edgar Allan Poe, The Cask of Amontillado, and The Telltale Heart. Poe was my man. We also read The Birds, the short story that actually inspired Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece. We read Romeo and Juliet, but still, teenage suicide, that was kind of a dramatic shift from most of the stuff that I had read in like 6th grade, which was like 21 Balloons, if anybody remembers that book. And then in 8th grade, I had a wonderful teacher who introduced me to a book that really impacted me. Probably more than just about any other book until I would eventually discover the works of Stephen King and then just go down the horror train. The book in question was The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Now, you might have heard of this book, or you might have seen this book, or who knows, maybe if you're somebody like me who went through the educational system in the United States, maybe your teacher assigned this book to you when you were about, 7th, 8th grade, maybe even in high school. This book is considered canon, and it's often assigned in grade school educations, at least in terms of the United States. And I'm not going to lie, this book hit me hard, and I've never forgotten reading this book. And now, having read it about 4 or 5 times over the course of my life, I still can summon images from this book in my mind. There are times when passages from this book will just suddenly pop into my head, and I'll think about it. Why did this hit me so hard? If you never read Lord of the Flies, the concept of the book is something that's kind of typical, or something that we've heard of before. Basically what happens is a group of British schoolboys are flying in a plane. Where they were going to, it's kind of unclear, but whatever the case, their plane crashes in a storm and they find themselves marooned on a tropical island in the middle of nowhere. Well, one thing leads to another. The kids try to establish some modicum of civilization and society. They try to get rescued. And then eventually the structures in place that create order and teamwork and, just general sense of virtue deteriorate. And the boys eventually begin to lose their minds. And they begin to imagine there are monsters on the island. And then eventually they wind up hunting the main character, Ralph. Who's supposed to be the figure on the front of the story, but is not entirely clear. Also red hair, though, so it's probably Jack. Anyway, this novel is not very important, or at least the details aren't important for today's video. But what is important is that this book introduced to me a very important lesson, which is that as much as we like to think that society and order and justice or even just the foundations of our society in terms of our empathy, our ability to cooperate as a team, just the notion that there is justice, period, or goodness, is one of these things that we like to believe is static and fixed and forever unchanging. This book is a reminder, or this book was my opportunity to really learn and process for the first time that no, it's not. In fact, anybody who's had their power off for like 24 hours and ever had to listen to hold music on their power company's phone company will know things can break down pretty damn quickly. And unfortunately, in situations when those societal structures fade away, people are not always nice. And some of the more horrific aspects of our species can come forward. Now, Lord of the Flies is not the focus of today's video, but it's a good opportunity to sort of create a mirror of this concept of what happens when the things that are supposed to be static and fixed go away. Well, as the title suggests, you know already, recently I began reading The Drifting Classroom. Hence the confusion, and you may have noticed a little slip in my previous video too. Yes, The Drifting Classroom. Excuse me. See, this is why you watch the entertainment. The Drifting Classroom by Kazuo Umezu. This book has been remarkably influential in terms of the comics community and in terms of the artistic community at large. The writers of Stranger Things cited this book as an influence, and Junji Ito himself has cited this work as a primary influence upon his work. This book, and I'm not going to go into the history of it because I could never give a great history of this book. All I can say is that I walked into my local comic book shop, Ground Zero Comics, and Michael, the co-owner of the shop, told me, "Hey, have you ever tried, The Drifting Classroom?" And I said, "No, what's that?" The book came in, I bought a copy, and well, I'm going to talk about it now. So let's hop into this weird, wonderful book and figure out exactly why I think it's worth talking about. Okay, before I continue, Dissolving Classroom is by Junji Ito. The Drifting Classroom is by Kazuo Umezu. So, drifting, dissolving, drifting, dissolving, drifting, dissolving, drifting. We are talking about drifting today, not dissolving. That wasn't really for you, that was just for me, because I know I'm going to butcher this again. Anyway, what is the general concept of The Drifting Classroom? Well, again, very similar to The Lord of the Flies by William Golding, the general premise is that a group of grade school students find themselves effectively removed from the rest of civilization. But whereas while The Lord of the Flies was a book about a group of British schoolboys being isolated on an island, The Drifting Classroom takes a different approach to it. The general concept is that a school in Tokyo effectively finds itself transported really thousands of years in the future. Now, the first volume of this series, and there's about 3 of them, and it's important to note as well, Viz, the company that produces this, they do a lot of manga, has kind of compiled this into 3 big omnibuses. So, especially when we talk about manga, it's important to recognize that things like Volume 1 or Chapter 1 or Part 1, it's kind of difficult, because without going into all the intricacies of manga, oftentimes stories like this are really considered just one big book, but they're broken up into smaller sections. Say something like Yu Yu Hakusho is all one story, but you have effectively book 5 of the journey overall. Anyway, the students of this school, along with their teachers, find themselves suddenly transported thousands of years into the future on the ruins of Tokyo, Japan, but it's after an apocalypse. So they discover that the school is pretty much the only thing around. And naturally, because it's a horror manga, the general tension and sort of narrative conflicts emerge is that the students at first are terrified and petrified, and so are the teachers. But then, before they can really sort of figure out what is happening, one of the school, I was about to say lunch ladies, no, one of the school lunch preparers effectively begins killing students and holding them hostage and saying, all the food is mine now and you're all going to be my slave. And then not long after that, of course, after he is eventually caught and captured and taken care of, one of the teachers begins murdering some of the other teachers. And then the students go out into the wilderness of the desert trying desperately to find other people and find themselves exposed to a giant monster that looks like a giant silverfish. And honestly, I don't really know if there's a great way to sort of coherently or at least concisely explain the sort of rambling narrative that is the Drifting Classroom. And I say rambling here not in a pejorative sense, because while the story can certainly seem to ramble overall, what's important about the book itself is that that journey is really important. The story focuses primarily upon a young student who, of course, I can't remember his name, but I will find it and repeat it to you for my own self. Let's see. Shinichi Sho. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. We typically follow the story of a young man by the name of Sho. He's kind of a young troublemaker, but really that's not necessarily fair to say. He's just a boy who's a bit precocious, and he gives his mom a hard time. And the story generally follows that Sho, or the story generally goes that Sho is leaving his house, going to school, and before he leaves, he has this huge fight with his mom. And then he goes to school, and then everything happens. Now, one of the things I really want to talk about in this book is, as always, how is this book really interesting to me formally? Because especially when we're talking about something like horror, horror is a difficult game to play. As I talked a little bit about in Junji Ito's The Dissolving Classroom, there are times when horror and comedy can come very close to each other. And one of the things that I like about Ito is that sometimes he doesn't necessarily seem to care that much when it branches off into comedy, because he's just sort of following a narrative. The tone of The Drifting Classroom is different, however, because far more often there is a sort of constant tension. There's a sort of constant anxiety, and in terms of the reader, a lot of the horror is not just the shock value of seeing these awful things happening to these young kids. It's also more just about the fact of observing their helplessness and wanting, in some form or fashion, to sort of reach out some kind of hand and help them. But then, this channel is not always concerned so much about narrative, is far more concerned with form. What is the form of The Drifting Classroom? Or really, how does Umezu use the form of comics to really create this tension and a lot of the drama that impacts the reader? Well, one of the things that I find really interesting is his lettering. And throughout this book, he employs lettering in such a really interesting fashion. You'll note the use here of the word bubble. Now, this word bubble is really unique, you'll observe, because it's very, very spiky. Now, that doesn't seem terribly unique, you know, because, of course, there's a lot of booming going on. But then at the same time, as we go later on in the story, those spiky word bubbles are kind of ever-present. It's a little thing that's kind of easy to forget, but I found myself noticing it again and again and again and again, because regardless of what these kids were talking about, they were kind of yelling, they were being surprised, they were sort of in a state of constant tension and discovery and anxiety. And so a little thing like a word bubble doesn't seem terribly important, but again, it is, because without conveying that these kids are screaming or yelling, you have to find some way to present it to the reader. And so oftentimes the sensation of reading this book is really seeing a lot of kids yelling, and even when they're just sort of having casual conversations, there's still kind of like a spiky word bubble coming out going, oh, okay, these kids are being loud because, you know, they just saw a giant millipede that's trying to kill them. And it's also a millipede that's kind of mixed with a lobster. We'll get to that in a second. But again, when we're talking about the word balloon, the shape and structure of it, when it is employed by the cartoonist, can be an important way to sort of convey nonverbal communication to the reader, or really just to show the reader without bonking them over the head with it. But then as well, you see this boom, 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 boom.
This two-page spread is employed here at the moment in which the school is effectively transported through time, and these booms are a really good way to sort of create the dramatic explosion or create this moment as a huge effect. Because not long after we see this boom, 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 we see a young man, or we look outside, and we observe that something horrible has happened. And this is one of the things that's really interesting to me about the Drifting Classroom, and something my friend Michael pointed out to me. This book moves really fast. And it's important as a reader to slow down as much as you can, because sometimes a lot of these little formal elements are being thrown at the reader, and they're employed so well that you can kind of just skip right past them. Umezu is a brilliant draftsman, and if you look at the level of detail that is going even into, we'll just say, some of the less than impressive pages as well, there's still a lot of great work to them. If you look at this shot down here at the bottom of all the teachers looking, look at the attention to detail paid to that teacher's suit. That is a really crucial detail for a shot that is seemingly not that important. But again, if we really consider what's happening rhetorically in the story, these teachers, who are themselves supposed to be figures of authority, are struck dumb. Their bodies sort of create this barrier for Sho, who's trying to figure out what happened. And then, as we turn the page, we get this great big beautiful reveal. And now we have employed this gorgeous shadowy technique in order to really convey the darkness and the fear, the anxiety, and the terror that is going to grip these students, grip these teachers. Now, if I can go back again, to the boom, boom, boom. That sounds like a song, by the way. But if I can go back to that passage in question. What? Is it not? It's gone? See, this is what happens when you don't keep your pages marked. Again, if we look at this page, the attention to detail is important. The onomatopoeia that he's employing is important, but just as much is the idea that these elements are all working together to create this moment. And something else that I really want to bring attention to onto this page, or to this section as well, is that one of the really beautiful things to me about the Drifting Classroom is the way Umezu continually employs the two-page spread in order to convey dramatic action or important information to the reader. If we look at one of Sho's friend who's managed to avoid being transported into the future, when he actually shows up to the school, we get this gorgeous two-page spread. And really, if you can, pause your video real quick and look at this spread. Or even if you can't, if you have your own copy of it, take a moment and really look at the detail that's going into it. And then note, you have this one figure in relation to this great big gaping hole, and then surrounded by the comforts of contemporary civilization. It's a little thing, but Umezu knows how to use the two-page spread in order to really convey awe and a kind of almost sublime feeling in the viewer. Now, moving forward a little bit, it's important to recognize, and I recognize immediately that I'm often saying it's important to recognize, so I'm going to try to stop saying that as much. Watch me fail miserably. Now, if we move a little bit further forward in the story, after the major discovery that, oh wow, our school's been transported thousands of years into the future, the teachers try to establish order. Because again, this is a school. It's filled with young children, some of them very, very, very young. And any educator will tell you, managing children is difficult already. There's a reason why I never went into the education field, is I don't have the patience for children. The people who do, respect. Seriously, you rock. But managing children is hard. Managing panicking children on top of your own fear and terror is also really hard. And it's at this point that Umezu really begins to throw his characters straight into the events of the story, which is really, let's watch what happens when civilization, or whatever we call civilization, begins to break down. In one particular instance, the kids are screaming, and one teacher, grabbing a child, takes off his glasses, tells all the children to listen to him, cracks his glasses, and then slams it into the arm of this child. Now, this 2-page spread is really horrifying. And this is something that really needs to be sort of cautioned out to readers moving forward. This book is really hard and can sometimes be a tad triggering. My friend Michael, who recommended this book to me, had a child himself about 2 years ago and commented himself that he kind of had to stop because the damage that was being done to these kids in this book was really harrowing. And Umezu doesn't hold back. A lot of times, the victims of violence in the story are children. We're watching children being maimed or mutilated or murdered, and it's disturbing. Because again, these are children in a school. This is a setting that, narratively speaking, rhetorically speaking, psychologically speaking, is supposed to be safe. Or at the very least, it's supposed to be the space where there's absolute control. At this moment, we see a teacher harming and maiming a child in order to convey order. And Umezu is really, really stunning as a cartoonist in these 2 pages, because you can see it moves right here from this black, dark shading and keeping the light around him to this kind of like dramatic line work as he lifts his glasses off, cracks them, and then sort of dramatically declares, listen to me, and then slams them into the arm of a child. And it's at that moment that we began to focus on the pain. If you look at what he's doing visually in the story, it's incredible. He's using these black outlines to really convey the darkness and the dramatic action that will be the teacher stabbing this child, and then he allows the actual horror of this child's pain to completely swallow up this bottom panel. It's also important to recognize that we find out on the next page that this teacher in question literally just stabbed his own son. It's a horrific moment. And I would like to say that that's kind of like one of the earliest, or that's kind of one of the worst scenes, but it's not. This is a horror manga, and it's a hard one, because we eventually learn that Mr. Sakiya, the man who makes all the lunches for all the teachers and students in the school, begins hoarding the food. He begins attacking some of the students and threatening them, saying, "This food is mine, I will survive, piss off, get your own food." The students inform the teachers of this, and in one particular scene, we note Mr. Sakiya actually, beating a student who he's using effectively as a hostage. When the teachers attempt to confront him and try to challenge him, you'll note he grabs what appears to be a tank, pours it at the double doors where the teachers are talking and saying, "Mr. Sakiya, let us in, let us in." And in what is, in my mind, probably one of the most beautiful page turns in terms of comics, we see that he immolates them all. Now, some of the teachers are able to just sort of like knock off the flames, recover, and figure out a new strategy, but still, this is a really powerful image, and thematically is really important, because Mr. Sakiya, again, he's a man who makes food for the kids. He's a man who makes food for the teachers. In terms of a hierarchy, or a power hierarchy, he's considered kind of on the bottom. And as soon as civilization breaks down, or really in the case of the drifting classroom, as soon as the school is transported away from the structures of what we know as civilization, Mr. Sakiya immediately recognizes a personal opportunity. It's a selfish opportunity, but it's an opportunity nonetheless to kind of claim some kind of power or agency. This is one of the reasons why Drifting Classroom is a really interesting horror story, because rhetorically speaking, it can show you how once the traditional structures of power are taken away, human beings instinctively try to acquire some semblance of power for themselves or else for their community at large. And oftentimes, especially when we're talking about horror stories, the horror is what happens when people are willing to use what some would call immoral or antisocial behavior in order to acquire power for themselves. And if there's anything Drifting Classroom is about, it's about exploring that power dynamic. Mr. Sakiya becomes a monster who literally sets his peers on fire to protect all the bread and milk that's going to, quote, keep him alive. This is not the action of what we consider a sane man, but this is a man who at this moment is being pushed to the realms of survival and is willing to perform arguably evil deeds for his end goal. And again, formally speaking, this scene is really wonderful for the way. Again, if you look at the setup to this shot, Umezu uses a pretty basic, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 panels. Somebody correct me on my math. I was an English major, not a mathematician. He uses 7 panels, all of them pretty standard, at least in terms of size and arrangement. They're rectangular. This one is a tad vertical to really heighten the dramatic tension of the teachers knocking on the door. But again, there's nothing terribly dramatic in terms of the presentation. We have a little bit of play with black and white as he's grabbing this tank. But it's really when we turn the page that we see the sort of the 2-page spread being used once again for beautiful dramatic effect. We see words and automatopoeia being employed to really create sounds and sensations that we normally wouldn't, or that we can't perceive with our ears, but that we can kind of perceive by reading them, by witnessing them and observing them. And again, if you take the time to really sit down and look at Umezu's line work, it is sublime and stunning. And if it sounds like I'm simping for Umezu, I am. This man is a master draftsman and probably one of the best ink artists I think I've ever seen. So if you like comics alone, or if you like line work, The Drifting Classroom is a study in how to create scenes and environments and textures and sensations. I could talk all day, and I probably will. So I'm going to instead push forward a little bit further onto the next scene. Well, later on, after Mr. Sakia is captured and taken care of, there's an incident that takes place. The entire details aren't important, but we have a man by the name of, yes, Wakahara. There's a lot of names, and unfortunately it's been a while since I read this book, so I want to make sure I'm giving you all the right information. But what's important is we have this man by the name of Mr. Wakahara. Sho and his classmates up to this point have looked to Mr. Wakahara as this kind of noble father figure. He's the man who's going to take care of them in the struggle. But events kind of spiral out. The principal of the school loses his mind, and watching the principal lose his mind, Mr. Wakahara breaks. Now, it's important to recognize in this moment that he's sitting here saying stuff, tie me up, I don't know what I'm going to do if I'm not tied up. We turn the page, and we discover very quickly what exactly is going to happen. Mr. Wakahara, who up to this point has been a figure of virtue, begins to kill this other teacher. And the following page is Mr. Wakahara continues to kill the rest of the teachers behind the scenes, and then eventually leads a group of students out into the desert under the guise that he's going to help them discover something or hopefully find new life. Mr. Wakahara eventually begins killing the children, whether that be stabbing them, strangling them, or in one instance even hitting them with his car. This shift in character is really shocking and really disturbing, and again, a keen reminder of why The Drifting Classroom is a really good source of horror. We don't want to think about teachers harming students. That's something that, again, shouldn't happen. A teacher is supposed to take care of students. He's supposed to, or they are supposed to, care about the students' lives, their safety, their security, and their welfare. And in this moment, Mr. Wakahara's mind breaks irreparably because of this horror that he's just constantly observing. We don't like to think that a person can just sort of break down like this, but we forget that stress can be a real killer, figuratively and literally. And so, as Mr. Wakahara begins to kill more and more more and more teachers, and then eventually more and more students, it's disturbing because, again, this is a man who, up until recently, has seemed a virtuous figure. And, again, formally speaking, this scene works really well because, again, Umezu employs a lot of black and bold dramatic lines, as well as subtle line work and gestures to really indicate Mr. Wakahara's break. You'll see him first sort of observing the principal break down, this look of shock, the light that's sort of framing him in this moment. He seems almost angelic. And then as he eventually begins to break down, we don't perceive the darkness until eventually we wind up on the next pages. And again, this darkness is reemployed to really show how far this man is falling. Now, You'll have to read the whole story in order to sort of observe how Sho and his friends eventually escape Mr. Wakahara. And in fact, you'll observe in terms of this book, I'm skipping for this last section really far forward. There's a lot that happens in this first omnibus. This book is well over, let's see. Yeah, it's about 750 pages long. There's a lot that can happen in this book and does happen. But what's important is after Wakahara is effectively taken care of, read the book to find out. And after there is a small election in the school to determine who's going to be the de facto leader, we eventually return to an element of the story that was introduced during the Wakahara segment, which is the bug. Now, I like bugs. I love bugs. My dad was an exterminator growing up. I had bug books. There were bug collections. We had bunches of bugs in baby food jars. I remember black widows in baby food jars. It was so cool. So naturally, I'm going to geek out at this bug. But at the same time, I'm also going to make sure that I remember why I'm doing this in the first place. This bug is a real and substantial threat to the children of this school. And in fact, the last arc of this book is based around the students trying to defend themselves in the event that the bug finds the school and tries to eat them and kill them. And it does. Now, again, this is part 1 of 3, so the bug doesn't kill everyone. But it is important to note that it kills several students. But I wanted to focus on this page again because, once more, it's an opportunity to really see how Umezu is using the elements and the formal elements of comics in order to create a really interesting story. This bug, when it appears, takes up most of the page itself. And then if you actually look at the page, there is so much detail that is going into it. The bug itself is really based off of like millipedes and centipedes, silverfish, and then you also note claws. So there's a kind of scorpion quality to it as well. This is not an insect most people would recognize. Fun fact, of course, there are insects that look like this, and they're really freaking cool. And in fact, some of them aren't insects at all, but they're in the phylum Arthropoda. At least I believe Arthropoda is the phylum. Biology majors, remind me again, is Arthropoda a phylum? Anyway, who cares? I'm a nerd. We'll figure it out later. But what's important here is that he is using our understanding of real-world insects and creating a new kind of horror. But along with that, he's bringing a lot of detail into this thing, paying attention not just to the texture of the bug itself, but paying attention to the kinds of sounds something like this would make. Arthropods are like crabs and lobsters and bugs, and when they move about, they tend to click. They skitter. And using these bold font like this and using this kind of dramatic motion up from the bug, it heightens the tension. And then, again, using this next page and using a lot of these quick moving lines, we really get a sense for what a threat this bug poses because it can move so quickly. How is a bug going to be defeated by children? And that's part of the horror. This is where we move away so much from the psychological horror and we move into some interesting aspects of body horror and kind of existential horror, the elements that are beyond our control, and monsters. This is some of the really, really, really fun parts of horror because it's an opportunity to explore how wildlife can be sort of understood in human mind or reimagined in human minds as a threat to us. Exterior alien beings coming to get us is one of the ways that society can break down, because whether it be Lord of the Flies or the Drifting Classroom, we know and understand that the threat of the alien is a constant threat throughout the whole of human civilization, and leaders have employed it often to the effect of creating fear and paranoia. But what's interesting here is that this isn't a political tactic. This is just a real giant bug attacking children. And that's when it becomes a kind of weird monster movie. And it's so fun. And I could keep talking about this book, but holy crap, we're almost at a half hour, and I want to keep this kind of shorter. So, yes, looking at this book, formally speaking, The Drifting Classroom is almost a masterclass in what you can do with comics in terms of using wording and text and onomatopoeia, in terms of framing devices, the 2-page spread. There are so many wonderful formal elements that are making The Drifting Classroom such a great comic. And I can't wait till I get a little bit more money in my pocket so I can go out and buy the next one. So, yes, let's do the last hurrah and then call it a day. I was actually going to do Fragments of Horror by Junji Ito as the book here, but then I pulled out Yu Yu Hakusho during the last part, and I like, I put it out there. My little sister loaned it to me. I should actually use it. So, thanks, Emmers. You rock. So, The Drifting Classroom. Not The Dissolving Classroom. The Drifting Classroom by Kazuo Umezu. This book is amazing. When my friend Michael recommended it to me, I thought, okay, this will probably just be some like throwaway dumb horror story. But no, this turned out to be really great. And a reminder again of why I love the horror genre just as a genre. This book employs so many different types of horror to really dig at the heart of why is it that people are willing to do horrible things in order to survive or in order to acquire some kind of power. We don't like to think that civilization or just general decency can deteriorate so quickly, but it can. And that's one of the most horrific aspects of our existence, is as much as we would like to think that these structures we've built will be here forever, The Drifting Classroom is a really good reminder that that's not necessarily true. Sometimes things will just break down or disappear or fade away. And when it does, new priorities emerge, and we as a species have to determine whether or not those original structures of civilization, one, are still useful and relevant, but then two, are they worth fighting for? The Drifting Classroom isn't necessarily always a fun book to read, but it is still really formally interesting as a comic because it can employ, or it does employ, so many familiar structures in a way that feels new and invigorating. And by the end, I just loved this book. And so hopefully I've made you love this book, or at least generally curious? Curious. On that fuck up, let's call it a day. So, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Just all that jazz. It lets me know that you like the channel, that you like these videos, and you want to see more. And then maybe, hopefully, I can start monetizing these and, buy bread. Speaking of which, also don't forget, like I said at the start, there is a Patreon to support me, to support my art, to support this channel, to help me buy really cool, kind of expensive comics. Or even just, not as expensive comics. Though this was a bad example because that one was a little expensive. But anyway, it's helping me just be. And so if you want to help me keep doing this, it's $1 a month, a couple of pennies in your pocket. I would really appreciate it. In terms of The Drifting Classroom, the publisher is Viz Media. They're a company that publishes a lot of manga. And so this book actually recently became available again, so tracking down a copy of it may actually be a lot easier than it was a couple of years ago. Now, again, at the time of this taping, it is mid-June. By October or so, when this video airs, that may not necessarily be the case. But, nevertheless, try your local comic book shop, ask them if they've got a copy of it, and if they don't, they can probably order one for you. Likewise, don't forget that you live in a world with, public libraries. Go to your public library, see if they've got it in their comic/manga section, and if they don't, ask for an interlibrary loan form. They'd be happy to get it for you. And again, wanted to give a shout, before I forget, once more, shout out to Michael Siegler of Ground Zero Comics for recommending this wonderful book, Michael. I can't wait to get the next 2 volumes. This fucking rocks. And now, finally, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.